No one works in this field. We have like 30 people. It's terrible. Welcome to a walkthrough of Finding Neurons in a Haystack, case studies with sparse probing. This is a particularly exciting walkthrough because this was led by Wes when he was being supervised by me. So this is my first time getting to a walkthrough on a paper where I get to consider myself the supervisor who advised on things and shared wisdom, but didn't actually do any of the actual work because that was Wes's job. Do you want to briefly introduce yourself, Wes?
Yeah, so I'm a second-year PhD student at MIT. I did Surrey Maths with Neil and have really just sort of shifted my whole research agenda to mechanistic interpretability. And this is my first real project. So
Wes' PhD is officially in discrete optimization, which is why this paper has some like random bullshit about discrete optimization in there, which we will get to. Do you want to give us the 30-second, why does this paper exist?
Yeah, so past mechanistic interpretability work, started with vision models in the initial circuit thread, and this gave us a lot of ideas of sort of what to expect from neurons, in particular that they're feature extractors. So you would have early layer neurons, which sort of detected boundaries that were then constructed into curve detectors, and then eye detectors, and then dog detectors, right? Unfortunately, in language models, the story seems less clean. And in particular, there was the recent Anthropic paper on toy models of superposition, which showed that a big confounder in all of this is superposition, where you have more features than neurons, and so individual neurons will react to multiple distinct features known as polysemanticity. A big thrust of this work was figuring out how these concepts, both things that we've learned from vision models as well as toy models, transfer to full-scale language models, and sort of understanding the different sort of things that neurons could be doing, different motifs there. Yeah. Do you want to add anything, Neil?
Yeah, maybe the way I would phrase why I find this paper interesting is that models are cursed high-dimensional objects. In order to make progress in reverse engineering an object, you need to be able to break it down into smaller bits you can think about independently, like how we might take an enormous vector and break it down into different basis elements. The hope in the early days of Mech and Turk, when everyone was bright-eyed and naive and thought this all would be easy, was that we could just look at neurons, and neurons were meaningful, and life was great, and everyone was happy. And this is initially kind of a wild argument, because while people in the field broadly believe that models represent features, the properties of the input they extract as directions, neurons are just like a basis among many, many possible bases. So why would you expect features to align with them? But the theoretical argument goes that features are things the model wants to allow to vary independently. Every neuron has its own nonlinearity on it. And so if two features share nonlinearity, life is sad. If each has its own nonlinearity, they can vary independently, life is good. And so there's this great theoretical argument that the models will have interpretable neurons. And then this turns out to be kind of bullshit, because in practice, neurons are often polysemantic. Different neurons seem to correspond to many different things. They seem unrelated, though we can never quite rule out there's just some galaxy-brained alien abstraction that explains all of them, because you can never rule that out. It's like, models, so weird. This is just kind of confusing and annoying. And this Anthropic paper, Toy Models Superposition, that I have a separate walkthrough on, proposed this hypothesis that it was because models were compressing in more features than they had neurons, and doing some clever compression schemes to recover interference. This was a pretty compelling hypothesis. This explains why neurons mean multiple different things, and features correspond to combinations of neurons, but it is also the case that, like, they looked on toy models, and no one has looked on big models. And I find it kind of embarrassing, because I think superposition is like the big open problem in mechanistic interpretability that we need to understand how to deal with in order to recover this dream of models as breaking down into interpretable units that can be understood in isolation. And we just kind of suck at this. No one has checked in language models. And to me, the story of this paper is going out and checking and seeing what happens and seeing what we can learn and trying to ground all of these conceptual models. End wrap.
Yeah, so maybe it would be helpful just to define terms a little bit. We've been referencing to this sort of general notion of a feature. And fortunately, in mechanistic interpretability, we really don't have a good definition of what a feature is. In this paper, we really just said, a feature is just an interpretable property of the input that like most humans could understand. So for example, whether or not a particular piece of text is in French or not. So this neuron on the left in figure 1a gives a concrete neuron in a Pythia 70 million, which reacts if and only if a token is in French, as far as we can tell across the distribution. And so we call this a monosemantic neuron. This is a neuron which just responds to one feature.
Should probably clarify. Monosemantic means it only responds to one feature. We have not proven this is a monosemantic neuron.
Right.
But it's to illustrate the definition. We'll get more into Neil being a pedant later.
And of course, this is in contrast to a polysemantic neuron, which reacts to multiple independent features. So in this case, on the right, we have a neuron which reacts to particular n-gram. So this is the way to interpret this plot is this is the activation of all of these are for the activation of a single neuron. The activation of this neuron on the gate token when it's preceded by research, that's this blue box, versus all other possible prefixes. So this neuron responds to the research gate feature, but no other type of gates, where research gate is a particular sort of scientific platform for disseminating new research. So research gates are quite distinct from all other gates.
Just clarifying, when we say n-gram, we don't mean the thing of if you see ice cream predict Sunday, we mean just detecting that a string of common tokens has occurred. So this is like ice cream detection, not predicting Sunday if you detect ice cream. Though plausibly, compound word detectors are being used for this. And we're using n-grams because they aren't necessarily words.
So yeah, ice creams versus other types of ices or other types of creams is essentially the sort of classification problem. So yeah, so this is a monosemantic neuron and a polysemantic neuron. Superposition then is representing n features in d dimensions where d is less than n. And we'll talk about the two main types of superposition. You have representational superposition, which happens in the residual stream, but then also this computational superposition, which happens within the MLP layers. And this computational superposition is what we mostly focus on in this paper. Maybe one last definitional thing is that of a privileged basis. So this is some basis where you expect the canonical basis elements to be independently meaningful. So if you just like look at dimension 3, you should expect it might actually mean something as opposed to just living in an arbitrary vector space. And so within a transformer, most parts do not have a privileged basis. So it does not make sense to like look at individual dimensions and conclude anything specific. So in particular, the residual stream, the query and value vectors do not have privileged bases. However, the MLPs, right after you apply this pointwise nonlinearity, creates a privileged basis. And therefore, we might expect that each individual neuron, its activation to encode something which is meaningful. And this gives us the decomposability property that Neil was talking about, which is very important for understanding neural nets.
Digging a bit more into these definitions, I think people often kind of conflate superposition and polysemanticity. But I think these are completely different things, and in particular, different categories of things. Polysemanticity is a behavioral observation. You just look at a neuron, you look at what it fires on, and you're like, oh, multiple different stuff. Then superposition is a mechanistic hypothesis that explains polysemanticity. And it's like much stronger, it's much more specific, it's much more interesting. But there are many other things that could potentially explain polysemanticity. A kind of intermediate concept that's also worth defining is the idea of a distributed representation. This, I believe, is an idea that's popular in neuroscience, or at least neuroscience people are the most likely to ask me, haven't you guys just reinvented distributed representations? So the idea of a distributed representation is rather than something aligning with the neurons, it's distributed across a bunch of neurons, which, at least in a neural network, I'm going to say is a linear combination of neurons, some like direction in neuron space. And this is only interesting in the context of a privileged basis, some setting where you have a reason to expect the individual basis elements, like axes, to be meaningful. Privileged basis is also often called like axis aligned, for people who prefer that word. It's surprising we get distributed representations when we have nonlinearities per neurons, because surely you expect that things correspond to the nonlinearities. But there's actually a couple of different things that could explain distributed representations. There's just some like skew or rotation. Features correspond to orthogonal directions, but they're just like a bit rotated from each other and like rotated from the neural basis. But fundamentally, we just need to do some dimensionality reduction to find the right directions, and life is good. Then there's superposition, where the model is compressing in more stuff than it has features, which just like obviously needs to be distributed because you have more things than you have neurons. And there's this third, more interesting one called composition, which there's a recent Great Anthropic blog post on, which we don't really get into in this paper. But the idea is that models generally have a natural way of representing their thoughts that's kind of the representations the model thinks in and does processing in. And sometimes this can differ from how we think about stuff or what we try to extract. A concrete example is if we're trying to understand how the model represents, say, different shapes, like red triangles, green circles, blue squares, etc. If we look for a red triangle feature and find that we need a probe that uses 2 neurons, it's possible that one of the neurons represents red, the other one represents triangle, and the model is thinking in terms of color and shape separately, and red triangle is just using 2 of them. Or it could be the case the model is representing all possible colored shapes as different encodings of neurons. And knowing that it's distributed across 2 neurons doesn't immediately tell you what's going on.
Mm-hmm. And at this point, you made reference to the word probe. We should probably define what probing is, given that it's in the title. So another difference from the language models from vision models. In vision models, you have this really nice technique of feature visualization where you can just sort of backpropagate and create an image which most excites a particular neuron. And this gives like each individual neuron this like, very visual, like variable binding, you could say. But there isn't an analogous technique for language models. And so we need some way of sort of like figuring out what particular neurons or what features are being represented. One very popular way of doing this is called probing. The basic idea here is you have some labeled data set. So like imagine you have your text data set and you have for every token, it's like part of speech. And then you could think about like, okay, for all verbs and non-verbs, yeah, so you want to detect the verb feature. And so you have your data set of all verbs and non-verbs. You then pass this through the network. You do a forward pass on all of this data, and you save the activations. You then take an external classifier. So this has nothing to do with the actual model. A simple logistic regression, the simpler the better. Some simple linear classifier. And you train this classifier on the internal activations of the network to predict this external property, being a verb or not. And if you can get a linear classifier, which perfectly classifies whether or not something is a verb or not from the internal activations of the network, this is like reasonably compelling evidence that the network knows about this feature. Potentially. It could be correlational, right? There are all sorts of confounders, but it at least gives some evidence that this feature is represented. I think what is even more compelling, though, is if you can show that it's compactly represented.
Maybe before we jump onto that, I can just give 3 pushbacks on why probing is boring. So we can explain why your technique is interesting in the context of the ways probing sucks. So yeah, first, just like briefly summarizing what probing is. You think the model represents something in some internal activation, like the output of a layer or a neuron. You take a bunch of inputs labeled by whether the feature is there or not, like in French or not in French, and you train some very simple classifier, like a linear regression on this, to extract them. And the hope is that, like, if you get good accuracy, that means this activation represents that. The input does not clearly represent it, so the model has extracted the feature. All right, so 3 issues with probing. The first is more of a taste objection, that I dislike how Wes equates the idea of feature visualization and images and probing in language models. So I think that a really core principle when you're trying to do mechanistic interpretability is, can I be surprised by what I find? In general, models often represent their thoughts in Byzantine or unexpected ways. We think the model is representing spirals with a neuron, but actually it's representing curves or something like that. And generally, probing requires you to go in with some hypothesis for what feature is hiding there. Like, we think the model is representing French, when potentially the model represents French nouns, French verbs, and French adjectives as three separate things. And our probe just like combines those, but not in a way that corresponds to how the model thinks about French. And also that if the model was representing something we didn't expect, probing, I think, is just fundamentally kind of screwed when it comes to telling us this. Such that I'm very interested in techniques that can help us figure out what we are surprised, help us be surprised by what happens inside models. And to me is a lot of what's distinctive about Mechanterp, where we are like, I'm going to be a biologist and I'm going to stare at the guts of this model and see what weird shiny things come out. All right, that was objection 1. Can we be surprised? Objection 2 is that probing can lie to you if the probe you're training does a bunch of computation that the model was not doing. Or rather, that the probe does computation such that you think the model had represented the thing when it had actually not represented it. In the trivial case, if you take an internal activation of GPT-2 small and train GPT-3 on it, you can probably extract whatever the hell you want, assuming that the thing has not lost key information from the inputs. This should just work. But like, this is not interesting because you want it to tell you how the model is doing things. And people often do things like use nonlinear probes, where they say have a one hidden layer MLP with some nonlinearities in the middle. And I generally think this is just kind of sus, because if you need a nonlinear probe, probably this is doing computation that the model is not doing, thus it's not really telling you what the model is stored. And the third objection is that probing is fundamentally correlational rather than causal. It tells you this activation can be used to predict this label, but it does not tell you why, it does not tell you if the model uses that, which I think the red triangle example from before is still applicable. If the model has some direction representing this is a red triangle that gets used downstream, setting that direction to 0 should destroy performance on red triangle related tasks. But if there's a separate red direction and a triangle direction, destroying that direction is going to be kind of weird because this isn't the frame the model thinks in. This is actually a bad example. A better example would be the model realizes there's a red triangle, and then there's 3 downstream things that each use this information to do something else. Like the model wants to look up and also step right and also raise its left hand if this happens. And the look up bit of the model is going to correlate with whether there's a red triangle. So your probe could use that to recover what's going on. But if you wanted to answer some other question about how the model computes that there's a red triangle or how it uses this, that just isn't going to tell you much. I don't know. General lesson of interpretability, it's so easy to trick yourself. The literature is full of illusions of people who had clever probing papers that did not tell them what they thought it told them. End rant.
Yeah, definitely. And so, I mean, sparse probing still definitely suffers from some of these. I think the biggest one being that you need to go in knowing what you're looking for, right? So you need to a priori be like, I think the model will represent French, and then like make a data set, a labeled data set that has examples of French and non-French. Obviously, a good language model is probably going to represent the feature I am in French versus not. But for more subtle features, this is basically just trial and error. And because it's correlational, you'll often find something which is related, which you can then study in more detail. But indeed, sparse probing still suffers from that. I think the main thing which sparse probing helps with is that...
Maybe we should define what sparse probing is.
Right, yeah. So sparse probing is exactly the same setup as probing. The only change is that your classifier becomes even simpler now. So rather than just being a linear classifier on sort of like all of the neurons are on a particular layer, you restrict your classifier to only using k non-zero coefficients, which is basically just to say train a k-dimensional classifier where you need to sort of choose the k features from, let's say, a d-dimensional MLP layer.
So like you tell the probe you can choose the top 5 neurons in this
Right.
layer
Right.
and use those to predict the answer. And this would be a 5 sparse probe, and we vary 5 from like 1 to 4,000.
Right. And there are a few advantages of this. One is that you become much less susceptible to correlations. So in general, if you have a 4,000 dimensional space that you're training a classifier on, there are all sorts of like very subtle correlations that this classifier can use. Even though it's linear, it's still like pretty high powered when it has 4,000 dimensions or something to use. There's sort of many subtle patterns. So like, there might be certain, grammatical patterns that are like most commonly occur when a verb occurs, but that don't in and of themselves sort of represent the verb feature internally to the model. Whereas if you sort of restrict your classifier to use only a small subset of neurons, you're much more likely, to the extent that these representations are localized, to find them. And this also gives you a better jumping off point to do more rigorous interpretability. So a big sort of theme of this paper was run sparse probing on some features, get just like a small handful of neurons that are then like more amenable to poke sort of more manually in much more detail, and just like discover interesting things about them. And then, of course, in the limit, if k is equal to 1, you're finding individual neurons which potentially encode these features, right? And so this becomes much more valuable if you have a technique of just pointing at exactly one neuron and saying that this neuron individually basically perfectly predicts whether or not something is in French. And this only makes sense in a privilege basis. So sparse probing only is sort of sensible to do on the MLP layers because you can expect each of these neurons to be independently meaningful, and therefore like just one neuron might represent something, whereas like sparse probing would not make sense on the residual stream, although there is some more recent research from Anthropic showing that there are some privileging effects on the residual stream, so maybe this isn't quite true, but in general this is sort of most principled within the MLP layers.
Yeah, just briefly elaborating on that. So there's this annoying thing where people often use neuron to refer to every element of any activation inside a model, and this annoys me. And I use neuron to refer to things immediately after an element-wise nonlinearity like a ReLU or a GeLU. And importantly, the only place in a transformer that this happens is the hidden state of MLP layers. And when we say neuron, we refer to that. And kind of in general, individual basis elements are not meaningful unless something makes them meaningful. So I think things like the residual stream, keys, queries, value vectors, etc. are not meaningful, except for the fact that we train these models with Adam, and Adam is not quite invariant when you rotate it, and there's an Anthropic paper being like, oh, it turns out Adam is the reason this shit happens. And it's very annoying. But I think that for the most part, it is accurate to say that the individual directions of the residual stream are not meaningful intrinsically. This is like actually a non-trivial point. And if you look at a bunch of papers, especially from before a mathematical framework for transformer circuits came out, which I believe was the first place that like really made this point, and you can see we have the walkthrough on it. There's like a bunch of papers that look at neurons where there's just residual stream elements. And this includes some like really good papers. Like there's this great paper called The Interpretability Illusion about the limits of max activating dataset examples, where you take the text that most activates a neuron and you look at that text and use this to try to understand what's going on. Because like, I don't know, if a neuron activates for a bunch of stuff in French, maybe it's a French neuron. But they looked at elements of Bert's residual stream rather than actual neurons, which makes their results so much less exciting. Or this paper called Causal Mediation Analysis from Vig et al. That was one of the first places that used the core technique behind things like activation patching that I talked about in my interpretability in the wild walkthrough, and was a really good paper. But then they tried patching individual neurons, by which they mean individual residual stream elements. And also, by this, they also described these as layer outputs, because this was also before people realized that you should think of the residual stream as like a central object, not something that belongs to the most recent layer, because most of the residual stream comes from things that are not most recent layer. Anyway, end rant.
Should we go on to key results?
Maybe a bit more. Actually, one bit of concept we really should have given at the start, which we failed to do, is like, why do we think features are directions at all? What's up with this? So this is a thing called the linear representation hypothesis, which is pretty well articulated in the toy models of superposition paper that you should check out my other walkthrough on. And the idea is models extracting features from the input. To quote Wes's first line of the introduction, neural networks are often conceptualized as being flexible feature extractors that learn to iteratively develop and refine suitable representations from raw inputs. Fabulously wordsmithed. Models are also made of linear algebra. Like anytime a neuron, that the activation of a neuron before the jello is just the residual stream dotted with a vector. And this means that fundamentally the only thing a model can do is project onto dimensions, which means it's really natural that if a model wants to later recover some feature to use to compute more stuff, that it wants to have these as directions in space. On the other hand, directions in space is just like a really specific thing to believe that models do in the space of all possible ways to ever represent things. And we have a fair amount of evidence for this hypothesis. Like, basically, anytime anyone has ever found a seemingly interpretable neuron, this is evidence for it, because a neuron's activation is a direction in space. It's just the basis direction corresponding to that neuron. But also, people really haven't checked very hard. And arguably, every single thing that interpretability has ever done is cherry picking. So, I would love people to go out and look for some more actual evidence. One case study that I was recently involved with that I think is particularly cute evidence here is there was this really good paper from Kenneth Lee called Emergent World Representations, where they trained a model to predict the next move in the board game Othello. And they found that the model formed this emergent model of the board, despite only ever seeing the moves that were made, and like chess notation style, piece was put on this cell. The model had learned at each time step to represent which cells were black versus white, but they could only find this with a nonlinear probe. But that this was all really exciting because, I don't know, language models only ever see tokens and predict the next token. And a bunch of people, like Gary Marcus, say, there's no way it could ever learn to model anything coherent about the world. This paper was also interesting because it seemed to provide real proof that they'd found this feature. They could causally intervene on the board, but only nonlinear probes worked, linear probes did not work. And what I found when I was like, this seems kind of sus. Linear, everything's linear, right? Why would this thing not be represented linearly? What I found by poking around is that the model actually represents, is the cell got the same color as the current player or the same color as the current opponent? And that each move, the representation flips. So like a cell goes from +1 to -1 back to +1 every move because who is the current player and who is the opponent flips. And from a human perspective, this is weird. From the model's perspective, this is totally natural because it's playing both black and white. And my two takeaways from this are A, linear representation hypothesis made a real fucking prediction and it paid off. And this is evidence that it is actually a thing that matters and has predictive power. And also, man, probing can lie to you so easily, especially if you're doing nonlinear probing, and especially if you go in thinking you know what features you're looking for. And the world of interpretability is dark and full of traps, and you should be careful out there.
And yeah, just to summarize, if you think about a transformer in particular, just its structure, basically every layer just applies a projection in and a projection out. So both the read and write operations for every layer are linear, where there's some non-trivial computation in between. But so for transformers in particular, I think it's quite natural to expect the linear representation hypothesis to be true.
So also, it would totally not surprise me if it's not universally true. And I would love someone to go out and be like, yep, I found this thing. It's actually represented in the following way. This is not literally the linear representation thing you guys ascribe. Boom, you guys suck. Fucking great project. Love to see it.
This is a little bit subtle, though, because in some sense, even if a feature at some layer sort of requires two MLPs to decode, after the one round of decoding in a subsequent layer of a transformer, then it will look like it's linear. And so like where you actually draw the boundaries of it, at what point something is a feature versus just like versus not, can be confounding here.
Yeah, my guess is the main way this could happen is if you had some feature that was represented as, say, within some bounded region on some interval, and everything above was something else, everything below was something else, which I'd argue isn't really a linear representation in the sense that I mean. And you could imagine something that uses, say, two neurons to extract this in parallel, like one to cut off this bit, one to cut off this bit, or something. More generally, if you've got a single neuron, you're just projecting onto a direction and then doing stuff on that. If you've got, say, 5 neurons in the same layer, they can start doing weirder stuff. My prediction is that basically everything the model cares about is represented linearly. But I don't really know. No one's checked, which is just true. Basically everything in McIntyre, because no one works in this field. We have like 30 people. It's terrible.
It's growing, though. It's growing.
It was like 5 a year and a half ago, so it could be worse.
Yeah, so maybe key results?
Yeah, maybe we just round off the exposition. Why is sparse probing actually relevant to superposition? Why was all of the rambling about superposition relevant to the stuff we did?
Right. So a concrete prediction of superposition is that, so if you want to extract or compute more features than you have neurons, then necessarily you have to have these neurons sort of working together to compute a feature. So one thing you could imagine is like the names of all people. So there are probably many, 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 many names of people that like these frontier models know about. But like GPT-3 only actually has 5 million neurons, right? So that's probably even, GPT-3 probably knows more than 5 million people already, right? And so already you sort of have to have some encoding strategy for representing more features than you have neurons. And because there's a privilege basis, and based on some of the initial results from the toy models paper, it's hypothesized that this is done by combining sparse subsets of neurons, which work together to sort of output a coherent feature. And this is maybe best demonstrated with a plot. And this is maybe one of our first key results. This is actual superposition in the wild, a concrete demonstration.